Bonjour, buenos dias, hello everybody. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and I have the privilege of being the program director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LERRN is a partnership between researchers, practitioners, civil society partners, and refugee leaders in Canada and in many other parts of the world, but especially focused on the needs and the opportunities that are identified by our working groups in East Africa and the Middle East through research, training, capacity building, policy engagement, and public dialogue. We're working to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the global refugee regime. This is especially in the context of enhancing the perspective, the amplification of the perspective of those who are most affected by displacement. So it's within that context that the theme of today's webinar is especially important. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I live and work and the land on which Carleton University is located is on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I say that not only out of respect and recognition of my status as a guest here on this land, but also out of appreciation for the fact that we can both learn so much from the struggle of First Nations communities, Indigenous peoples, and their organizations in the leadership that they have shown and in the way that they have advocated for and achieved opportunities for participation in many decision-making processes. And we learn from that, but also out of recognition that the issues of dispossession and dislocation that we discuss today are very much a part of the history of the land on which I live and work. With that, let me say how delighted we are to have more than 150 people registered for this webinar. This special webinar that looks at the politics and process of refugee leadership, looking at a comparative analysis of the factors conditioning refugee leadership in different regions of the Global South. Before we begin, let me just share some words about practicalities and etiquette. First, the webinar is being supported with interpretation in both English and Spanish. My thanks to the interpreters for providing this essential support. Instructions on how to access the interpretation have just been posted. Please make use of that. And let me also echo the need to go beyond the hegemonic status of English in the research that we do on these critical issues. Second, please note that the webinar is in the view-only format, so please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to post any questions that you may have, which we'll come to in a later part of the webinar. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send an email to learn@carleton.ca and we'll be able to help you out. That email address will appear on the screen. There we are. And please also join the conversation on X, formerly known as Twitter, by tagging @learning to help us amplify your thoughts and perspectives on social media. And finally, just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the LERRN website in the coming weeks. So keep an eye on carleton.ca/learn. So thank you for joining the webinar. What we're going to do is I'm going to take about 5 minutes or so to provide some background on the project, on its methodology, and on its core research questions. We'll then be hearing from Stephanie, who I'll introduce in a moment, as our lead researcher in South America, and Ronald, the lead researcher in East Africa. Ronald, Stephanie, and I will then have a conversation about some of the comparative points between what we found in the two regions, the 4 countries, the 8 locations where the research has been conducted. We're then very fortunate to hear from Lublanc and Mohamed from their perspectives on this work as partners in these 2 regions on how the finding resonates with their work. We'll then have time for a general discussion and Q&A before I give the speakers a last word. So let's get started and really understand why it is that we're presenting the research that we're presenting today. This is research that's been conducted over the past 18 months on the politics and practice of refugee leadership in the Global South. The research has been supported by the Gerda Henkel Foundation's special program on forced migration. So please make note of the Gerda Henkel Foundation's website, and we thank the foundation for their support. The research is motivated by a recognition that there's been significant interest on the issue of meaningful refugee participation and on refugee-led organizations in the last 5 to 10 years. There's been quite a bit of public attention that's been paid to prominent refugee leaders in the global north as they've engaged in discussions on enhancing the functioning of the global refugee regime. But within the work that we've seen, there's an important gap. On the one hand, work on meaningful refugee participation has focused on the participation of refugees in the structures that are afforded by the refugee regime itself, such as meetings in Geneva. Work on refugee-led organizations has focused on the engagement of refugees in the humanitarian or programming sphere. And by and large, the focus really has come from a global North perspective with some very notable exceptions. So we really want to ask questions about what about other forms of refugee leadership? What about other ways that refugees engage in activities to address needs of themselves and their communities, and especially in the context of the Global South, which hosts the vast majority of the world's refugees? So we want to, in this research, ask if, when, and how individual refugees or networks of refugees are able to demonstrate agency, to influence policy and practice that affects the lives of refugees more generally, and especially to focus on these very contested political environments where issues of power and contestation are most acute. So building from the literature that we already have, we focus on this question of the politics and process of refugee leadership. But we've also engaged in this work in a commitment to do the work in an ethical way that seeks to meaningfully engage in a co-production process and to co-develop this research with partners with lived experience of displacement and those most affected by displacement. We recognize the multiple forms of knowledge that exist and the ways that research can be amplified. So we have worked from the literature on political opportunity structures as a framework for understanding the conditions under which individuals can experience leadership. And we have also worked from the literature on leadership itself to say, what are the ways that we understand leadership? How do we define leadership as individuals who are able to demonstrate agency in proposing solutions to issues of shared concern and mobilizing collective action to pursue those solutions? We also want to be aware of ways that Western conceptions of leadership may be challenged. The methodology of the work has been not only to co-produce the approach to research, co-produce knowledge in the designing of the research, the development of the methodology, data collection, and the analysis process, with 50% of the research, the research associates supporting the research, 50% of them themselves having lived experience of displacement. But we've designed this as a comparative study between East Africa and South America, two regions that are very prominent in the literature on refugee participation and refugee-led organizations, and that host significant displaced communities. Within each region, there's a comparative study between Kenya and Uganda in East Africa, Colombia and Chile in South America, and also then to compare within each country between capital cities and a border region. So with that brief introduction to the methodology and the framework that has guided this work, let's hear from the findings from the two regions. First, let's start with South America, and I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Stephanie López Villamil. Her bio, full bio will appear on the screen in a moment. Let me introduce Stephanie as a colleague that wears many, many hats, but in this context, as the South American lead researcher for the project. She has over a decade of experience in research, policy advice, and advocacy and consulting activities on issues relating to migration and refugee policy, refugee rights, and issues in the context of South America, with an emphasis on Colombia, where she's made major contributions to projects involving public policy design and institutional capacity building. So, Stephanie, let me pass the floor to you. What are the main findings of the research from your team in South America? Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you, James. First of all, I want to acknowledge and thank all the leaders who agreed to participate in the study, as well as my research assistants, Connie, Alex, and Chris, for their support. And having said that, my presentation is divided into 4 parts, and I will try to be as brief as possible. So first, it's important to contextualize a little bit what's happening in South America and what's been happening in the past 10 years. So we decided, as you mentioned, to work in Chile and Colombia. Colombia actually hosts almost 3 million displaced Venezuelans of the almost 8 million that have left the country until now. Chile has also received around 700,000 Venezuelans and about 180,000 Haitians. So for the field work, we chose to work in 2 capital cities. So that is Bogota and Santiago. Bogota is the capital of Colombia, and it hosts over 600,000 Venezuelans, while in Santiago there is approximately 438,000 Venezuelans. So just to see the scale of what the displacement has been in South America, particularly. We decided also to work with Haitian and Venezuelan leaders, since these were the two major forced displacement that we found in South America. It's also important to say that they are forcibly displaced, but they are holders of different residence permits created specifically for their nationalities. They're not formally recognized, most of them, as refugees. In the context of South America, Brazil is the only country that has recognized Venezuelans as refugees. And in Colombia and in Chile, also most of them already have the Chilean or the Colombian nationality. That means they have 2 nationalities. So we carried out 38 semi-structured interviews with leaders. Some were online, also in different cities. Focus group discussions, key informant interviews with international organizations, government officials, and also United Nations staffs. And we visited 5 refugee-led organizations. So, secondly, I will talk a little bit about leadership and what we found when we asked the leaders if they consider themselves leaders. Not all leaders recognize themselves as such, and some consider it's more of a process, like they didn't become leaders overnight. And someone said to us, "I do not see myself as representing anyone." There's also a difference. There's long-term leadership, which is like political leadership or community leadership some of the refugee leaders had in their countries, versus what we call the more circumstantial leadership. Is like I had to become leader. There was no option for me because I had to help my own people. So we found also that gender is a very relevant factor, particularly within Venezuelans. Most of the women we interviewed find it more difficult to define themselves as leader. So finally, a leader is defined as an agent capable of mobilizing the population towards certain common objectives, directing or guiding processes, and joint work to obtain certain benefits. Also, leadership, they told us, requires community acceptance, support, and validation. And some of the skills of the leaders include listening to others, knowing the needs of others, the vocation for service, the willingness to help and be in connection with the group that you work with your community, Very important, networking, but also managing, organizing, negotiating, sorry, etc., etc. Thirdly, in terms of participation and advocacy, which we dig into in the research, we found that there were differences in the objectives according to the different nationalities. So, for instance, it was different for Haitians and for Venezuelans, as we will see. But it all included awareness raising, humanitarian assistance, but also political advocacy, the activities in which leaders are involved. So we found out there are different strategies they use for this. So the first one, as I was saying, was awareness raising and training. Training the communities, but training other leaders as well. The second one was informing the communities about the services and rights available and facilitating the access to these services. The third one is lobbying, for instance, in Congress. In South America, migration laws have been changing, and there are a lot of amendments to these migration laws. So there's a there's a there's a strong lobby from civil society organizations, but also helped by refugee-led organizations. Fourth, there's media leadership. For instance, many leaders use Instagram and other social media to inform and to advocate for the causes. And we also found in this media leadership new, usually young, very young leaders that interrogate traditional leadership and that interrogate which are the spaces in which they can participate. Not every leader participates in political spaces and takes part of the mechanisms of participation, but they use other ways to exercise their leadership. We also find several barriers that have already been mapped for our laws, but I think for their participation and advocacy, we also even identify other barriers specific to leaders, which is the first one I think it's really important to acknowledge is the fear of going to the authorities, because sometimes of the fear to being deported. The second one is obviously the lack of information. Once you get to the host country, you don't know how the systems work, etc. The third one is lack of training of the leaders and organizations. Many times they don't have the tools to manage their own organizations. But also, when they arrive in the host country, their lack of contacts and networks, and many also stereotypes and negative discourses associated with them. Particularly, we found this in Chile towards Haitian. There's a lot of racism involved. That results in many difficulties in accessing these mechanisms for participation and advocacy. Also, just to say, most of the mechanisms for participation are non-binding, and most of leaders don't participate like in these mechanisms as having a vote. Sometimes they have their voices heard, but they cannot have really an impact on the decisions that are taken. And finally, and this would be my last point, in terms of power relations and the political opportunity structure, which James already mentioned, I think a first important point to underline is intersectionality. Although there are significant number of women leaders, we found that, for instance, in the Haitian community, the presence of women is decreasing, or we find more difficult to access these women leaders. There's also, as I was saying, a racist structure in Chile that prevents Haitians from participating. And uh, it's also for leadership uh, important the prior political background that some of these leaders had, particularly Venezuelans, for accessing the spaces, like creating networks and having community recognition. Most of them were political leaders back in Venezuela. They belong to a political party, so that's like a heavy influence. Also, the political affinity with the administration or the government would allow or facilitate this leadership, this participation, and these advocacy processes. That means me being more, being closer to like the right wing or the left wing can also facilitate this process. In the case of Colombia, we found that there is a very, very strong competition for resources provided by donors. I'm not going to dig into this right now, but USAID was a big, big donor in Colombia. Most of 92% of the aid came from USAID, but also other United Nations agencies and international NGOs. So all these actors are key for participation and advocacy because they facilitated most of these mechanisms and spaces. Also, something that I mentioned before, it's possible to find collaborative networks between organizations of the same nationality. So we have, for instance, Coalición por Venezuela, we have PACUR and other networks uh, that serve as joint forces for advocacy. But we have to say also there are conflicts in power relations between leaders from the same nationalities, and that was salient in some of our discussions. So to finish, looking ahead, we have, I think, four issues that need to be addressed to strengthen this leadership. First and foremost, it's psychosocial and mental health support. I'm not going to dig into all the 4 points, but also obviously funding directly our laws. There's also the question of capacity buildings and creating more opportunities for meaningful refugee participation. So, to conclude, in Latin America, with a constant flow of displaced persons across borders and the multiple ad hoc or temporary permits and forms of, let's say, on protection, leaders have emerged to respond to the needs of migrants and refugees, but also as powerful voices contesting restrictive measures put in place by some governments. So, advocating for their rights, they are recognized by host communities as powerful agents representing migrants and refugees and their needs. However, in host governments, leaders are not recognized as having a voice and void in the decisions that directly affect them. So, with this research, we are aiming to shift the power, but that's a difficult task. So, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a really rich presentation in a very short period of time, just so that everyone in the audience knows that the full reports from the two regions will be available, we hope, within about a month's time on the website that was posted there, the project website for this. And there's so much rich detail within that. Stephanie, I also want to note you mentioned while we're looking at the structural environment within the countries where we're researching, of course, all of this takes place within a changing geopolitical structure environment, and it's difficult to know how the reverberations of these changes will be felt, but also exactly what form these changes will ultimately take and how lasting they will be. So we'll look forward to discussing that in more detail in our discussion time. But Stephanie, thank you for that. And now let's turn to the East Africa context, where we're really fortunate to have the presentation of the work there from Dr. Ronald Sebba Kalyango. Ronald is the East Africa research lead for the project, but he's so much more than that. Ronald is not only doing this researcher, but he's also a lecturer in the Department of Social Work and Social Administration at Kyambogo University in Uganda. He's worked extensively on issues of displacement, gender, social policy, public health, not only in Uganda, but elsewhere in East Africa. Ronald is involved in a number of transnational research collaborations and always does it with a smile. So, Ronald, thank you for your humor in navigating some of the challenges that have been encountered with the shifting context of research in East Africa. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation on the research. And so, Ronald, over to you, please.
Thank you, James, for the introduction, and welcome to all our participants for this webinar. And the research in East Africa, we carried out together with Pascal Zigashane, Lavender Mboya, and Saja Andrew in Nachivale. And I want also to extend our thanks to our collaborators, Arasit, Refugee-Led Research Hub in Nairobi, RELON Uganda, as well as Yarid, among others, who enabled us to carry out the project and to go ahead. Looking at East Africa, the study sought to understand the politics of refugee leadership in East Africa. And we will know that East Africa hosts one of the largest numbers of refugees within the region. And unfortunately for us, we keep on receiving new arrivals, like what's happening in DR Congo, South Sudan, among other places. So it is a continuous flow of refugees into the region. And the study was also carried out in two study sites, that is Uganda and Kenya. We studied in Uganda, the study was carried out in Nachivale refugee settlement and in Kampala for the urban refugees. While in Kenya, the study was carried out in Kakuma refugee settlement and Nairobi for the urban refugees. Just like the South American case, we also worked using case studies. We worked through key informant interviews, focus group discussions with refugee leaders and refugee communities, key informant interviews with UN officials, governments, as well as refugee leaders and other persons that are actively engaged in the process of refugee management. Fortunately for the East African team, we also managed to be participants as well as non-participant observers during dialogues and workshops that brought together different stakeholders to discuss issues relating to the rights of refugees within the region, harmonization of policies, such as the Refugee Durable Solutions Framework workshops, where we are looking at harmonization of refugee policies within the region. So all these provided us a rich access to information and data on refugee leadership. By context, East Africa's main sending countries for refugees include the Sudan, South Sudan, where we have over 18% from Somalia, Eritrea, about 12% of the refugees, Burundi, Ethiopia, DR Congo, among others. And when you're looking at the context, we also find that within the region, both countries, Kenya and Uganda, and more or less every other country within the region, we follow a settlement approach to the hosting of refugees. Refugees are mainly settled in settlements or refugee camps where they subsist on food rations from either World Food Program, among others, and as well as a few are recognized under the urban caseload or as urban refugees. But what we also see is that there is an increasing move of self-settled refugees living in the urban centers and other cities within the region, which makes it a complex but also rich arena to study refugee leadership. When we look at refugee leadership within the region, what we see is that refugee leaders will have what we refer to as the traditional and cultural leadership structures, are mainly composed of cultural leaders, clan leaders, and clan heads of persons that are fleeing into the region. And these are always based on where they are coming from. We also see formal refugee leadership structures, which consist of the camp administration. Refugee leaders are appointed and elected from among the refugee communities based on the refugee settlements mainly. And this is usually by government or by UNHCR. And these leaders, the refugee leaders, help in camp administration. And the best example we have for this are the refugee welfare committees in Uganda. Beyond that, we also see that they will have several individuals as refugee leaders. Refugee leaders here are largely perceived as individuals or groups of persons who see a problem within their communities, and they move forward to take action to either solve the problem or mobilize people so that they can be able to speak in one language in having a problem solved. And what usually happens with the refugee leaders is that what motivates them is the desire to cause change in their communities. Not so much about being leaders or being seen or being visible or accessing resources, but usually they come out to, they desire to see a change in their communities. And from our research, we also find that most of the refugee leaders who are recognized as leaders now start off as activists. They come in as activists to speak up on different issues affecting refugees. And that was, for instance, in Uganda. In Kenya, some of the people we talked to came in as interpreters for either UNHCR or non-governmental organizations, among others. They came in to interpret and assist refugees. And through that process, they are cast into a leadership role to try to see and cause a change for their communities, among others. Others come in as researchers with scholars. They come in to do research, academic research. They research their communities, they recognize needs, and they seek out ways and means of solving these needs that they identify in their communities, whether with or without any portfolio within the communities. They go out of their way to be able to do something about what the problems their communities are facing. Then others come in just as concerned refugees who ask questions, who seek solutions, and then among others, and then they're able to create that kind of environment whereby they're able to influence and act on community needs. What is interesting is that the individuals as refugees, sometimes some of them come up to form what we refer to as refugee-led organizations. Refugee-led organizations here are increasingly becoming a prominent feature among the refugee communities, and they're largely founded by and often emerge from formalized leadership structures. They come up to form organizations, kind of from formal structures. And one of the motivations to form refugee-led organizations comes from the aspect of leaders, humanitarian organizations and governments trying to work with formalized institutions who can be able now to work on behalf of the refugees and give them funds, among others. And then on the other hand, we also have what we refer to as women refugee leaders, either as individuals or as groups. Women come in strongly here because most of the individuals as leaders, most of the refugee-led organizations, most of them are led by men. And it also follows that most times they tend to follow a male-centric agenda, looking at the needs of refugees, but mainly the male refugees. And the women always feeling left out of the, filling the gap. They try to come up to advocate for their own needs and speak up for their own needs. And by the end of the day, they form refugee-led organizations that are predominantly for women, and also see them as women as leaders. But unfortunately for the women, they're usually in the lower echelons of refugee leadership, either as self-help groups within the communities, supporting structures, among others, and few of them really come up to form what we know as refugee-led organizations. Like South America, the roles and expressions of refugee leadership in East Africa come in different ways. One is that we see refugee leaders as mobilizers. They usually mobilize communities to protest or resist programs or interventions that they think are not in favor of their communities. During the fieldwork, we are caught up in the July 2024 riots that were sparked off by the news that food rations for refugees in Kakuma had been cut by over 60%. And so the refugees were up in arms to try to speak and act against this kind of resolution. And the refugee leaders were keen in mobilizing communities to advocate, to speak up against these kinds of injustices. Then we also see refugee leaders as advocates. leaders bring to attention to major stakeholders the needs and seek to find solutions for the refugees. Groups like the Young Refugee for Integral Development (YARID) in Uganda, LERRN, among others, have been key in advocating for the rights of refugees, but also, interestingly, not just about political rights or participation in decision-making, but also economic inclusion in the urban centers, in terms of trading licenses, trading space, and all those things that they need to be able to, for a livelihood. In Kenya, for instance, the advocacy has been engaged mainly surrounding the Shirika Plan, whereby the urban refugees and as well as others have kind of come up to advocate for the inclusion and participation of refugees in the day-to-day management of their affairs. And under the Shirika Plan, for instance, refugees are now included as partners, as technical partners with the government and other major stakeholders in the management of the refugee affairs within Kenya. It's still at its nascent stage. We've not yet seen how far this is going to go, but I think it's a foot in the door for refugees to be able to participate. Then we look at the challenges of that are faced by the refugees. And among the challenges faced by the refugee leaders is the challenge of tokenism. In terms of refugee leaders, the practice of superficially including refugees in leadership roles or decision-making processes without genuinely empowering them or giving them substantial influence, or what I can call power without power. When we look at tokenism, one of the refugee participants told us that meaningful refugee participation will be participating in a space where there is no patronage, first of all, and it's not tokenistic. You are not just being brought to say we have 2 refugees on the table, and it's seeing that what you have said on that table has been taken into consideration. So it's not just about having the numbers, but it's about us as refugees speaking up and making contribution on what are the issues that we need. And for the refugees, that's what they really look at as meaningful participation. The other challenge we see is about the refugee leaders. Whereas they're increasingly taking on leadership roles within the refugee communities, women are traditionally, because of their gender roles and activities, are usually limited, and they are grounded within the traditional roles and not expected to be as leaders. Even when they come up as leaders, they are rarely listened to in the table or at the table within the refugee communities, within the refugee-led organizations, among others. Even within the RLOs, there is a limit to which refugee women can rise up to speak up on issues of for the refugees, among others. So having looked at that, we see that one of the major barriers for participation of the political opportunity structures are the legal frameworks that limit refugee participation in terms of the laws that don't allow them political organization, that limit their voice, and also in countries where we don't respect human rights and civic rights, it becomes very, very difficult for refugees to ably engage, to ably articulate their issues in one way or another. Asante sana. Let me stop there for now. Over to you, James.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ronald. Asante sana. That was a very, very rich presentation, and sets up a really fascinating conversation between the findings in East Africa and in South America. And so I'd like to take about 10 minutes before we invite Lublanc and Mohamed for their reactions, just to tease out some of the points that I see coming up between the 2 regions, and to invite your reactions on this. And in the interest of time, let me limit myself to 3 areas. The first is very much in what we mean by leadership across these 2 regions. That there's a sense that conventional understandings of leadership is that there are structural opportunities, individuals sort of pursue the opportunities that exist. But what we hear in the 2 regions is that refugee leaders by accident or design are much more entrepreneurial, that they need to create these opportunities, that that sometimes it's in the context of individuals, sometimes it's in the context of organizations. but there's quite a bit of variation in the forms that leadership takes. And I think one of the most important conclusions is to recognize the real diversity of the ways that leadership is expressed, and the way that it's presented. But within that, there's sort of these expectations that are placed on those who do step forward in leadership roles, in terms of as being mediators, problem solvers, conduits to resources. The ability for leaders to be able to make claims on other actors. So, just as a quick question to you both on this question of the forms that leadership takes, what surprised you the most about, the forms of leadership, the way that leadership was expressed? What sort of came out for you from the research as sort of, a surprising takeaway about the way we think about leadership, or the way that we need to change our thinking about leadership? Stephanie, do you want to take a first stab? What surprised you the most about the forms of leadership that you encountered in the research?
Thank you, James. So I have to state I'm a political scientist. So I came as a researcher. I was biased, I think, very biased in thinking all of leadership needed to be part of some kind of political participation space of mechanisms. And as I said in my presentation, we found that many young leaders do not believe in politics, or like traditional politics, but they find other ways to advocate. And these other ways to advocate is more, I would say, about social movements, not really organized in a structure, but rather more democratic, if I could say that word. So that surprised me. And it surprised me that there are like young leaders, particularly Venezuelan leaders that are very young and that they have only lived under the Chavismo, which is the authoritarian regime that's been going on in Venezuela for the past 20 something years, since 1999. So having that in mind, I think not being affiliated with the political party necessarily, or not being part of a strict or traditional political structure, and being out of these structures, but being leaders outside of these structures is very bold sometimes, and they reach out young people as well. So I think that was one, let's say, if we can say, type of leadership that really surprised us. And seeing so many young women involved in this, it was very surprising for me, and like trying to think, for me as a political scientist, outside of the box, it was a quite interesting finding.
Mm, yeah, and thank you, and Ronald, I think this notion of sort of, disciplinary assumptions, also being a political scientist, you assume that, leader, I sort of came into the research assuming that we'd see leadership in very particular institutional ways, but with your background, Ronald, coming more from a social policy, community organization perspective, in the East Africa context, leadership, there were different forms of leadership, youth leadership. You mentioned some of the barriers to leadership, and we'll get to that. But also, the traditional forms of leadership, emerging forms of leadership. So, Ronald, in the East Africa context, what surprised you the most about our understanding of the meaning of leadership in the context where you work? Ronald, over to you.
Thank you, James. In the context of East Africa, when we talk about the meaning of leadership, I think what surprises me is that the refugee leaders looked beyond just participating or just taking part in meetings or just being around, but seeking directly, how do we solve the problems that we are experiencing, that the refugees are facing? How do we help and enable them to be able to achieve their goals? So it wasn't about position, that I am a leader, I'm the boss, but they're looking at what can we be able to do about the problems that we are experiencing. And one in particular is how they are able to negotiate outside the formal framework or structures of the refugee management of the OPMs, of the governments, among others, to negotiate with communities, to negotiate with local municipalities for a space to achieve trade goals, to achieve livelihood goals, to get someone out of prison, or to get somebody access to food, or to give somebody shelter, among others. And in this way, they're able to demonstrate leadership by taking an initiative to meet community needs, as opposed to just having a position and only sitting in meetings and discussing with others. So I think for me, that was a kind of a key aspect about the leadership within the region. Over to you, James.
Yeah, thank you, Ronald, because it's fascinating because it really does raise this question about, leadership being situational, in response to particular moments or needs versus leadership as something that's more institutional and established. And the point that you make about, leaders, not needing to be in a position of saying, being the boss and sort of having a leadership doesn't necessarily equate with having a position. But yet we find in the research from both regions, we hear very strongly, and this is teased out much more in the draft reports and in the regional analysis, that the scope and nature, the constraints on leadership, or the factors that condition the way that agency is demonstrated are really quite nuanced, right? That we see, the scope that agency can take, whether it's autonomous, whether it's relational, the power relations that we see between different networks, leaders that are trying to emerge that may be suppressed by more established leaders or networks. We see this in different contexts, but we see this also very much from an intersectional perspective. Ronald, you mentioned the question of gender, right? Of how individuals with identify as women are not able to achieve the sort of same leadership ambitions, whether they strive for or are able to achieve that. What we see in terms of class, of resources, education, what have you. But I think also really striking is the question of race, right, and nationality. In East Africa, why Congolese and Sudanese are able to advance leadership ambitions, and yet there are more challenges, for example, for Somali refugees. In the case of South America, what I learned so much, Stephanie, is really this difference between the leadership opportunities for Venezuelans versus Haitians, and how anti-Black racism plays such an important role in constraining that space. So a last question to the two of you before we bring Lublanc and Mohamed into the conversation is really, what surprised you the most about the conditions that constrain or limit opportunities for leadership, right? In terms of the factor that that creates barriers. We'll come to recommendations later in terms of resources and Stephanie, you mentioned questions of legal status. But what surprised you the most in terms of the factors that constrain leadership? Ronald, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Stephanie. Ronald, over to you, please.
Thank you, James. Interestingly, one of the factors that constrains leadership is also the one that supports leadership, and that is the legal framework. Whereas the legal frameworks give room for participation, they allow refugee leaders to take part, make decisions, among others. Once it comes to the actual implementation and the practice, the refugee voices are rarely heard or even listened to. That's why they complain and say, we don't want to be in the numbers, we want our voices and issues to be heard. So that still remains a challenge to get their voices heard within the meetings to which they are welcomed into. And maybe very quickly, the second one would be resources. Refugee leaders lack resources to be able to move and act and do those kinds of things that they would have been able to do to meet the needs of their communities. Accessing resources is constrained by the legal frameworks, by the documentation. They don't have documentation to have financial records, bank accounts, among others, which are needed by the donors to give them the support that they need. So they always find those kinds of challenges on a daily basis. Over to you, James.
Yeah, thank you, Ronald. Stephanie, from your perspective, what are the barriers that perhaps surprised you the most? Go ahead, Stephanie, please.
Well, adding to, we also found the same that were found in East Africa, but for what you mentioned about anti-Black racism, we found two things. First is language, like mostly in South America and in Latin America and the Caribbean. Well, also Latin America, we speak Spanish, so the language is a heavy burden and to participate. And if you don't speak Spanish, basically you're not like accessing these spaces. That would be like the first. It's not surprising, but I think it has to be mentioned because it's really important. And I would say what was more like striking in terms of resources is, as I mentioned, in Colombia there are a lot of resources, or there were until now, a lot of resources and funding for or RLOs and civil society organizations. But in Chile, that is not the case because Chile is a middle upper income country, so they don't receive that much aid, but the needs are there. So most of the leaders have constraints in terms of resources. But even though, despite these constraints, I think like the lobby work they're doing is amazing. And the work they're doing without having any funds and having full-time jobs on this, it's not side jobs, it's full-time jobs, and then exercising leadership, it's like amazing. So in terms of there are constraints, but we also have to see how they manage, and they go on the sides and find pathways to exercise the leadership like successfully in most cases. It's yeah, I say it's good. I don't want to get into the details, but between Haitians and Venezuelans, it's also quite different.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Stephanie. And on the question of language and the roles of Haitians, I know that the Hemispheric Network on Haitian Migrant Rights has been doing quite a bit to raise awareness about how simple questions of language, speaking French and Creole, and the inability to engage at the same level in Spanish-speaking environments, it is a particular constraint, but one that we can overcome. I note that in the Q&A box, we already have questions from Bakir, who's joining us from Indonesia. Thank you, Bakir, for being with us at this late hour in the evening for you. And joining us from Germany, Osama, thank you for the question that you have posed. We'll be coming to those questions in a moment, but first I'd like to bring in two partners who've been engaged in this research, playing various roles in supporting the work. I'm keen to hear first from Lublanc and then from Mohamed with your perspectives on what you have heard within this work. So first, Lublanc, to you. Let me introduce Lublanc, joining us from the South American context. Lublanc Prieto is the director of Fundación Refugiados Unidos, and the bio will appear in the chat box. Lublanc has more than 14 years of professional experience between Venezuela and Colombia. She's a specialist in international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law, and brings rich experience. Lublanc, as Stephanie was saying, not only doing your day job, but everything that you do in addition to that. So thank you for making time for us here. Lublanc, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on what you have heard from the presentations today, how it resonates with your experiences, and perhaps what surprised you in hearing the findings from the two regions we discussed today. Lublanc, bienvenidos.
Thank you, James, and thank you for the space and for the importance of taking us into consideration. I give you a round of applause because being in a safe space as this one in which we are talking about the refugee leaders and their processes and their realities is not common to hear this at a global scale. So I applaud you for this. What caught my attention in regards to this research? Well, this research, I think, has been very depth, and our partners that explain in the two regions have several things in common with the leaders in general. And something that popped in my head a lot, in which leadership, we don't recognize the leaders that we are. Let me explain myself. We feel, and I think Stephanie said this also. I told Stephanie, I don't feel myself as a leader. I recognize myself as another voice of my half brothers. I mean, we are united, doing one whole voice, and most of them cannot reach those spaces where we do reach. But for us, it's hard to recognize that we are leaders, and in the sense that we also have a cultural stigma because of the background that we lived in our countries from where we fled. And for this reason, we reach countries where we face similar situations like this one, where we are afraid to say that there's a leadership or that we are leaders of a community. This is because there are several cultural differences, security aspects, and these aspects create stigmas and finger pointing. So we prefer to say we are in the process of raising our voice, but we are not leaders. That's something important, and that it amazed me. And something that also I found interesting is what Stephanie said that I also share right now, is that several occasions we can see that leadership go with a political process, or where even a process of political principles. And truth be told, when we say this openly right now, this is not the case. It's not about political parties, or it's not about ideology consideration. What we want to do is create process of social movements and process so our real voices are really heard. And there's an effective collaboration within the communities and outside the communities at an international scale. And for this reason, I want to point out these 2 points because they are very important. And we don't need to keep on managing it in a sense that we are doing political movements or we want to favor a political party. What we are doing are real movements for justice, so our voices can be heard and our participation can be heard within the powers of the state, because we're tired of our voices not being heard and people to talk about us without us being there. This is something to point out. Even in the research, I think my 2 colleagues, Ronald and Stephanie, pointed out this in the reports.
Muchas gracias, Lublanc. And I think that last point is so crucial to understand that when we talk about refugee participation, it's beyond humanitarian programming. It's beyond it's beyond the delivery of services. It's very much about a movement of justice and the pursuit of solutions, and the intensely political environment within which displacement happens. I think, for example, of where we are right now in thinking about political change in Syria and how discussions about the reconstruction of Syria or the repatriation of Syrians, how can we possibly imagine a discussion about the future of Syria without including the millions of Syrians who have been displaced? And so to think about this beyond questions of humanitarian programming, but about the roles of those who've experienced displacement in really imagining the political future to which they belong, and how it's not just an inclusion of voice, but it's that expertise and that perspective that makes those solutions so much more legitimate and accountable as we move forward. So that was a very powerful point, and I thank you for that, Lublanc. Mohamed, let's move to you now, and I'm so delighted that you're here and so grateful for the role of RLRH. Mohamed has been a supporter of this research from the beginning, and I'm very grateful for that. Mohamed Hassan is a research officer with the Refugee-led Research Hub in Nairobi. His full bio is there, but let me just point to two particular dimensions of Mohamed's profile that's so interesting and important here. His own research work focuses on the evolution of identity in protracted displacement. And I think that really points to the question of remembering that the situations of displacement, the context of leadership, sometimes can extend for generations of displacement. That it's well beyond this emergency phase and what that means. And that also speaks to his own experience of a leadership role within the Kakuma camp, where you were before moving to Nairobi, where you were an elected zonal chairperson for quite some time, where you represented the needs and interests of fellow refugees. So Mohamed, I welcome you and I recognize your expertise both as a researcher and as someone who has tried to work and practice within this space of leadership. So Mohamed, a warm welcome to you. Karibu sana. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you heard from the two regions. Mohamed, over to you, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, James, Dr. Ronald, Stephanie. Thank you all for having me. I have 5 minutes and I want to discuss 3 points. One is reflections on what you shared, and then maybe 2 points I want to bring up. I think from the study, I really like that it had a gendered aspect. We don't really see that looking at leadership from a gender perspective and the challenges that come with it. And then I think the focus also on global South processes and how leadership is demonstrated and how it operates in the global South. I think those are valuable contributions to the literature, and we don't always see this. The 2 points I wanted to discuss is one, the meaning and expression of leadership. I think one thing that we say often is leadership, refugee leadership, being reduced to access to spaces rather than influence. So access to rooms, to high-level meetings, the right to have a voice, the right to speak, the right to be on these platforms. And from my own experience as a leader and from the research I've done, leadership is much more than access to spaces, I think. And one thing we can see is the desperation within communities and the lack of change for communities, the lack of progress for communities, especially when it comes to critical issues like food insecurity, when it comes to durable solutions, when it comes to these core collective ideas, we're not making that much progress. And I think that the focus should be how can we influence policy? How can refugees have influence? The second point is around, right now, everyone acknowledges and understands the role of participation, the value of leadership. But I think what is still missing is there is still exclusion within supposedly inclusive spaces. It's good to have refugees because they bring legitimacy to the room. It's good that they're on board, but then their input and what they have to say is not really taken as a priority or is not really considered. And I think that is something that people don't really see. They want the legitimacy that refugees bring to the table, but they're not necessarily interested in the input of refugees themselves. And I think the power to set the agenda, to shape decision is still beyond the reach of refugees. That is exclusively reserved for non-refugee experts. So that is one point. Second point was we have to recognize that refugee leadership does not happen in a vacuum. It does not exist in a vacuum. It is part of a broader struggle against systemic exclusion, whether we are talking about racial rights, social justice, African leadership, indigenous leadership. All of these things are combined. And especially in the aid sector, the refugee response sector, we've seen that in the past 30 to 40 years, especially on this side, in East Africa, where we've had protracted displacement, we've seen an entrenched system of othering, that is based along colonial ways of doing things, around colonial modes of governance. And that system of othering, it pigeonholes people into roles based on, there's a hierarchy of, that is on class, race, gender, migration status. And some of that also seeps into the idea of localization. So within the Global South, when these discussions around shifting power to the Global South, issues now emerge of who is the local, who is now representing who is speaking for who is the intermediary, and this idea of we speak for communities because we are more proximate to them. So that system, that entrenched system of othering has to be, really understood, and we have to take steps to actively dismantle that. Otherwise, it seems that we are circling the issue. Going forward, what do I think are maybe some of the points we should consider, or what is needed for us to enable refugee leadership. I think we have to go away from one of the barriers I found in my own experience as a leader in the camp was this idea, the resistance between the need for external validation. Validation comes from agencies, from external people, people who have the resources, who have the opportunities, who have the funding. They have to validate you in order for you to be anyone or to become someone. And then on the other hand, you have the community expectation, the people that you represent, the communities that rely on you. And that is that tension of community legitimacy versus external priorities and external validation. And I think one of the ways we can reduce that conflict is by adopting accountability mechanisms. This is a space that is in general very anti kind of accountability. It's easy to have reports for donors, but as we've said many times, upward and downward accountability on every level, whether it's RLOs, whether it's donors, whether it's states. How can communities hold people accountable? And I think that idea of accountability should be there. The second thing of what we need to do, I think, is ideas around transfer of skills and resources to the people that matter. We don't want to replicate an elite, class that has a political network, social capital, that has, that's concentrated all the opportunities. The idea is, how do we devolve this? And especially for non-refugees, for global North practitioners, how can we allow that skills of transfer to happen so that refugees are actually in a position where they can enable systemic change? How can we see them be leaders in these organizations, in these spaces? And that requires an investment. It requires support in people, support in refugees, themselves, and being patient. I think one of the things that we see here in Nairobi, because we advocate for a lot of organizations to bring on board, and our message is that, if you're a refugee-facing organization, there's an ethical and a pragmatic question. How inclusive is your own organization? How can you claim to support refugee leadership when you don't have anyone, within roles in your own organization? As a hub, we say that leadership should not just be espoused. Leadership has to be exercised. It has to be institutionalized. It has to be felt by other people also. So one of the ways is when we say create space in your organization, people say, okay, let me just put out an advert. But for refugees, because of the imbalance, people need more than an advert. They require intentional support. You have to develop that, you have to nurture that talent. We know the education system is not the best. We know that there are no, meaningful internships. There are no meaningful opportunities for refugees in these camps in other places. So as an organization, have to set aside support, be more intentional about how you bring on, people on board and how you develop their leadership capacities. So I would say my parting message is there's a narrow definition of what refugee leadership is, and that is often away from the organizations. It's a very specified, narrow parameter of leadership, people being in their own communities, refugees leading other refugees. But what I think should be the next level is, how can we have refugees leading systems of change? How can we have them leading non-refugees in these spaces? How can they be leaders in the organizations that claim to support refugees? I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Oh, it makes perfect sense, Mohamed. Thank you, and it leads perfectly to some of the questions that we've had in the Q&A box. And I mean, to answer all of these questions within 90 minutes is very challenging. So let me pose three questions that we've heard, and Lublanc, I know that you have so much to share on all of these points. So let me start with this question about structures, about the point that you raised, Mohamed, that on the one hand, there's the need for structures of accountability within organizations, those who claim to represent communities. How are they accountable to those communities? How can how can refugee leadership be exercised in a way that's seen as legitimate and accountable by the communities that they represent? And I know, Lublanc and Mohamed, this is something that you've both thought about within the communities where you're working, and Stephanie and Ronald, it is part of a question that came up in the research Osama Salim asked the question if there are structures or best practices to enhance that accountability so that those those examples of refugee leadership that sort of reach that scale and capacity, don't suffer from critiques of legitimacy and accountability. How have you seen these questions of structures to advance accountability and transparency? How have you seen those challenges be taken on within the regions where you work? Maybe Stephanie and Ronald, I'll come to you first and ask, are there sort of examples from the research that you can point to? And then Lublanc and Mohamed, I'll be keen for your thoughts on this as well. So, Stephanie, can we start with you? Are there sort of examples or lessons about more of those internal mechanisms and structures that where we might learn general lessons from the research that you've done? Stephanie, go ahead, please.
Thank you, James. So I think the big difference, and I have to state this before I respond, is that like this refugee leadership in South America is very recent because the displacement is very recent. So it's different from the case of East Africa. So here very rapidly, like people started to organize, and since I would say 2018, there was a multiplication of RLOs, and yes, it's sometimes it's a one person RLO, so you don't think that's an organization as such, but as time has passed, there are like a couple ones that have very strong organizations that have received funds from international donors. And that was a learning process. And I have discussed this with Lublanc several times about accountability with their communities. Because it's not easy for refugee leaders sometimes to get in the host country, understand the systems, create and register their organization with the institution that we have to register the organizations. And in terms of not all leaders have managerial skills, and that is something that was very important. So I think there's a great job that the bigger organizations are doing with new leaderships is hey, you have to learn to manage, you have to learn this accountability process, you have to like gather your communities and tell them what you're doing and where the funds are coming from, etc., etc. And I think it's been a very interesting learning process, but not all of our laws achieve that. And when they do not achieve that, then they can't receive funds, and like it circles back into vulnerability and etc. So I think it's a very important point that they're raising here in the questions, because we have discussed this with many leaders and how to improve this and how to make them accountable for their actions. I think it's very important.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Lublanc, let's go to you then with these themes about the structures of participation and these questions of accountability and transparency, legitimacy. It seems on the one hand very easy to critique RLOs in not having these elaborate structures, but what are the lessons that you have from these experiences in the context of where you're working? Over to you, Lublanc, please.
Thank you, James. Well, it's a great experience because, as Stephanie said, we're new on this. We come from more or less 10 years ago to finding this mobility in which we began roughly because not people knew about the leadership. They didn't know the humanitarian structure because it wasn't their common activity. And therefore, they had to learn along the way how to do an accountability. And this does not mean that it is not done correctly or that it is not being done. It is practically a stigma that we have within the humanitarian system, and we've had to navigate in a system when there are other stigmas in regards to vulnerability and the lack of knowledge and the lack of technification of leaderships and of organizations led by refugees. And those stigmas, we've had to take them down like domino pieces. And although we began like along the road and trying to overcome the barriers, for example, about creating the organizations, creating the bank accounts, the technical structures, and how are we accounted for within the communities, and always giving the budgets. And how do you make the accounting for budget if you have no resources? Well, that's also a very important question, because you talk about the leaders and the organizations led by refugees, but if they don't have resources, how do you talk about the reports and accounting? How do you talk about the problems or supposedly problems of lack of transparency if they've never had funds? So it's not just that the system created a stigma that for a refugee does not deliver accountability reports because of his lack of knowledge and because they are vulnerable. It can be more that a stigma and less the truth, where we have shown that the ones that have received resources, we show what we do with them, and the ones that don't receive resources are receiving the knowledge, but how do they show they don't have any knowledge? And we have cases, success stories, for example, in my organization that is led by refugees, and we have presented reports and accounting, we have procedures, we have structures where we have once and again reflected the assessment, the reports. In an international scale, we have received resources from international cooperation. And I want to point out the reality we are currently living with, what has happened with the United States and Trump's decisions of blocking the resources, because this impacted the organizations. We are one of the organizations that are in risk of bankruptcy and of closing. And for this reason, what we want to call upon attention is our voices, to hear our voices for real, and saying that this is not a stigma reality, that we're seeing that we don't provide reports. We want more knowledge. We want more technification. We want to know how to provide accounting reports in the humanitarian aid protocols. But if we don't have the opportunities to do this and to demonstrate we can do this, it's kind of hard for us that they say we can't deliver, but how are we going to deliver if the funds are going to be blocked? How can we technify this? And we are being more and more we're showing a report that says that our impact is bigger and better than several structures of the UN. And why do organizations led by refugees change lives? They develop, they gather the confidence, and they provide solutions that the population really needs, in difference with international organizations of several years from the UN, for example, and they don't provide accounting reports, they don't provide resource reports. So let's be serious. They ask for auditing, but when do UN organizations, for example, sit down to show the whole world and the whole refugee community what have been their reports, what have been their real impacts, and how have they spent the resources? That's a reality. And to us, it's the contrary. On a daily basis, we report and we give them our lessons learned, and we show them our reality and our reports and our accounting. So the reality of what we are doing right now, I will continue to say this, we need to stop the stigma of our organizations led by refugees.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point. And within that, Lublanc, there's the question, that refugee-led responses are typically more efficient, more effective. Refugees more frequently turn to refugee-led organizations before UN agencies, that they're seen as more accessible. But, the way, and we'll come to this in a moment, the way that the international humanitarian system thinks about refugee-led organizations is very much as being small and niche and lacking capacity. So we have this sort of this stigma, which means that the opportunities aren't given to demonstrate that capacity. So in a moment, we'll ask how we resolve that. But Mohamed, I want to go to you now on this question, because this is something that has been really important within your own work, within the work of RLRH, is that idea of demonstrating that capacity, but in a way that is seen to be legitimate and accountable. Within the research space, there's such a history of wazungu, of external actors coming in, extracting knowledge and leaving, which is, we're increasingly seeing that as being, lacking in legitimacy and accountability, this extractive model that we have. In the chat box, we've posted a link to this wonderful paper by Asylum Access on the importance, really not just of building capacity, but of shifting power relations more generally. And we'll come to that in a moment. But Mohamed, I want to get your thoughts on this question of, where are there examples or lessons that you have about structures of participation that have addressed these questions of legitimacy and accountability from refugee leaders to the communities that they claim to represent? Is that something that's been, something that to which you can speak, or lessons that you have on that point? Please go ahead, Mohamed.
Thank you, James. Really, it's a deep question. It's a big question, and I want to clarify one thing at the outset. I think we don't want to repeat this idea that RLOs and refugee-led responses, they're always held to a different standard. We want to make them seem like angels who do all of these things. And I think this idea of accountability has always been the Achilles heel for the entire aid system. And I remember questioning and asking UNHCR and other INGOs, how do communities that you serve, how do they hold you accountable? What mechanisms exist for communities to give feedback, to say this is not what we want, this is not what we do? So that has always been lacking. So I just want to say that it's not something new that the RLOs have brought in. It's something that this industry or this aid system has really been accused of, and it's always been a challenge there. And I think we just want to avoid the NGO, the aid system reproducing itself in the form of RLOs. And I think this is why sometimes these questions can come up to say that, okay, the system got this wrong. Can you try to improve in this aspect? Can you try to do this better? So I think sometimes this is coming from a good place and a well-intentioned place. Ideas around best practices, I think the document you shared, Asylum Access, has really been helpful. And I think it's creating spaces where people can fail, especially for us. We bring in new refugees from the camps, from other spaces. Nobody was born to be a researcher. It takes time. People have to fail. You want to be a good writer, you have to practice and you have to fail. And that space of learning and relearning has to be there, and that support has to be provided. And I think that is what we found works for us. We've been able to bring in, we have interns who come in, students who come in and who stay with us, and they mature and they get their confidence. And then they get their research skills. So I think for the sake of time, that's all I will say to this. But I don't have any best practices that come to my mind at the moment. But I think co-production, and then ultimately thinking about, can we be in a place where refugees can lead themselves, where we take the training wheels off when people are ready, and then they're able to code to do something by themselves. Yeah.
And
Thank
I
you.
think that's so critical because otherwise, the expectations that we can place set up these initiatives to fail, right? That we have these unrealistic expectations. On the one hand, refugee-led responses produce these outcomes that are just extraordinary. But I think, Mohammed, to your point, if we say, all our angels, or that we have, so it's a balance between the unrealistic expectations versus the tokenization and this and the stigmatization that Lublanc talked about. And within that, the last question that I have, as a way of sort of wrapping up, that it's the temptation is for all of our critical inquiry to be on refugee leaders and refugee initiatives themselves. But of course, much more challenging questions need to be asked about international NGOs, UN agencies, governments, the way that they interact with refugee-led organizations, these challenges of tokenization and the questions that Bakir had in the chat. Ojas, joining us from Uganda, and thank you, Ojas, for introducing us to your refugee-led organization. Ask the question about how refugee leaders can better engage with these power structures where the inequalities are so acute. I would point to the work of our seat, Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table, and the training that they do before refugee leaders engage in political spaces like Geneva, and how that kind of political training can enhance their ability to engage in spaces such as in South America or in East Africa. But fundamentally, and this is why the paper from Asylum Access I think is so important, fundamentally, in engaging in these dialogues, there's this profound inequality of power. And so, how can the lessons from what has worked, the lessons of this research, how can it begin to change the way that the partners on the other side of the table engage with refugee leadership and refugee expertise? It's a massive question that we won't be able to fully answer in the 4 minutes that we have left. But I do want to give you each 1 minute to share a thought in terms of how can the kind of knowledge that we have shared in this webinar, how can it be used to bring about change in shifting the power equations between refugees and those who are mandated to advance solutions for refugees? How can we shift these power equations so that the expertise of refugees, the contributions of refugees, and others who've experienced displacement can more fully contribute to shifting these power structures? So we're running over time, but I think it's an important question that we can't avoid. Ronald, I'm going to try you first to see how your connection is. I'll ask you to keep your camera off, Ronald. If I can give you a last word on this, and then Stephanie, and then Mohamed and Lublanc, I'm going to give the final word to you, Lublanc. So, Ronald, over to you, please.
Thank you, James. I think my take here would be that to empower the refugee leaders to be able to meet the needs of their communities, to cause a substantive change that can better the lives of the refugees. I think that would be a better way to address the problem as compared to not sitting in Geneva, in Kampala, and other places without really transforming the lives of the refugees for whom the refugee leaders are speaking up for. Over to you, James.
Thank you so much, Ronald. Stephanie, to you, please.
It's a very broad question, so 1 minute. I think it's mainly also on part of the state and the institutions, and how like this, let's say, political will for including refugees is barely present in many countries. In South America, it is the case. There are some exceptions with Brazil, like Chile has mechanisms, although it excludes a lot of people. But in terms of shifting power, I think the best way, and it always will be to be, is dialogue and sitting the different actors on the same table and have a conversation and include like refugee leaders in these conversations. It's a beginning point for shifting power.
Yeah, and as I was always taught growing up, we have one mouth and two ears for a reason, because we need to listen twice as much as we talk. And so with that, there's so much more to say, and I will say a word of conclusion, but first Mohamed and Lublanc. Mohamed, to you, please, and then Lublanc.
Yeah.
Mohamed, go ahead.
2 points, each one 30 seconds. One, we need to overcome the trust deficit. There's a massive trust deficit that these NGOs are NGOs. They don't trust refugees to be in positions of power. That has to be overcome. The second point is more local. In light of the Sharika plan, camps becoming settlements, I think this idea of depoliticized spaces will have to come down, and refugees will have to participate in these political processes. Over to you.
Thank you. Lublanc, to you, please.
Thank you very much, James. I do agree with the other speakers. However, I think that it is very powerful to just beyond participation, it is important to also think about how leadership, how organizations can continue existing. They need to be given power, like true power, in order to continue changing lives, in order to have a real impact on refugees. We're talking about institutions, international cooperation, or international organizations. They need to look at us as real agents for change, as allies in order to build true change, because we are the ones who live this experience. We are the ones that have an effective solution. We are the voices that can change lives today. Therefore, it is important to hear our voices and to work hand in hand with us.
Lublanc, thank you. Such a powerful way to end this discussion. It really evokes the question that Bahati asked about whether this really is a question about structural change. You know, the structures and institutions that we've had for 80 years are premised on a very state-centered approach to responses to displacement. The record is that on its own doesn't work. And so the kinds of contributions and the expertise that we have been discussing need to be part not only of the responses that can be proposed, but in rethinking how power is allocated in decision making about the framing of responses to begin with. The research that we have from South America and East Africa points to the many different ways that refugee leadership takes form, in the different ways that it's able to challenge these power relations in everyday contexts. Mohamed, your point about how there are opportunities to rethink these power relations, these opportunities need to be seized. We need to be able to see them and then seize them. And Lublanc, to your point, which I think is so important, is the idea that it's getting beyond ticking a box, that it's very much about recognizing the substantive contribution, the expertise that can be brought to make these responses more legitimate, more accountable, but ultimately more effective. We've run over time. I thank everyone in the audience for being with us. I thank the LERRN team for the technical support. Thank you to the interpreters for enabling us to speak across different languages. My sincere thanks to Stephanie and Ronald and the teams in East Africa and in South America who've contributed this research. Please watch the website for details about when a recording of this webinar will be posted, along with the reports and a synthesis article that is to follow. Our thanks to the Gerda Henkel Foundation for the support. But my most sincere thanks, Lublanc and Mohamed, are to the two of you, not only for joining us in this webinar, but in the work that you do to challenge these stereotypes, to speak this truth that is so critical to be heard, and to be the leaders that you are, but in demonstrating that change is possible and change is needed. So my thanks, Mohamed and Lublanc, to you. My thank you to everyone. Wherever you're joining us from, stay well and stay safe. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Muchas gracias.